What would drive a perfectly ordinary teacher to kidnap a child in the middle of the school day? Not for ransom. Not for revenge. But because she truly believed that if she didn't, he might not survive the weekend. Now here's a question for you. If you knew a child was in danger, and no one else would help, would you break the law to save them? Before we dive into this unbelievable story, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. Mia Lawson had never broken a rule in her life. Not even once. She was the kind of elementary school teacher who brought extra gloves in winter and taped notes to forgotten lunchboxes. She color-coded her classroom and stayed late to sharpen every pencil before Monday morning. But all of that changed on one cold Thursday afternoon. That day, Mia shoved a 6-year-old boy named Jacob into the passenger seat of her car. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was thudding against her ribs like a warning. She slammed the door, turned the key, and without a single word, she drove. No goodbye. No plan. Just Jacob beside her, too quiet. And the road stretching out like a dare. The police would later call it kidnapping. The media would paint her as a hero, then a criminal, then a question mark. But when the man believed to be Jacob's abusive father finally caught up to her, he didn't come with anger. He came with tears. And he said just one thing: "I'm his real father." And just like that, everything Mia thought she knew began to unravel. You see, Jacob wasn't like the other kids in her class. He was small, soft-spoken, watchful. He flinched at sudden movements. He winced when anyone raised their voice. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would stare out the window like he was waiting for something, or someone, to come and take him away. Mia started noticing bruises. First on his wrist, then along his collarbone. She did what she was supposed to, filed reports. Called Child Protective Services. They came. They checked boxes. And then, they left. And nothing changed. But everything shifted the day Jacob slipped her a note, folded so tightly it could have passed for trash. 7 shaky words. Scribbled in pencil. "Help me. He hurts mommy worse." That night, Mia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, playing the what-ifs in her head. What if she did nothing? What if something happened to him? By morning, she had her answer. So when the class boarded buses for a museum field trip, and the teachers were busy counting heads, Mia found Jacob standing alone. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She took his hand. And they ran. No map. No plan. Only a single, terrifying instinct. If she didn't take him now, no one ever would. What she didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was that she hadn't rescued Jacob from a monster. She'd taken him from the only person who ever fought to keep him safe. Before Mia Lawson ever took Jacob from that field trip, she had been watching him for weeks. Quietly, carefully, with growing dread. To most people, Jacob was just another quiet boy in a room full of louder kids. A little shy. A little slow to smile. He colored inside the lines. He raised his hand before speaking. He never caused trouble. But Mia saw more than the surface. She saw the way he froze whenever someone slammed a locker too hard. The way his shoulders would tense, just for a second, whenever an adult walked too close. She noticed how he never volunteered to read aloud, even though he could. How he always kept his lunch in its wrapper, untouched, like he'd learned to ration food. And the bruises. They started small. Easy to explain. Kids fall, right? They bump into things. But one morning, Jacob came in with a deep purple mark across the inside of his arm. When Mia gently asked what happened, he stared at the floor and said, "I fell." No tears. No anger. No emotion. Just 2 flat words, rehearsed. And that's when the pit began forming in Mia's stomach. Not because of the bruises alone, but because of what they meant. Jacob had learned how to lie. Not to get out of trouble, but to survive it. She filed a report with Child Protective Services that same day. Wrote everything down, every bruise, every pattern, every time Jacob flinched when someone said the word dad. 2 weeks later, CPS came to the school. They pulled Jacob out of class for 20 minutes. Asked him a few questions. Then they left. The case was marked inconclusive. No follow-up. No one called again. It was like trying to scream through soundproofed glass. And just when Mia thought her heart couldn't sink any further, Jacob started drawing things. Children draw what they see, what they dream, what they fear. And Jacob's drawings were not the kind you hang on a refrigerator. He drew houses with no windows. People with no faces. He drew himself standing in the corner of a room, while a towering black figure loomed behind his mother. In one drawing, the mother was lying on the floor, red crayon spilled across her cheek. And Jacob was standing beside her, holding a stuffed animal, alone. Mia kept them, all of them, quietly. Not because she thought they'd be enough to prove anything, but because she couldn't throw them away. Because deep down, she feared those might be the only real evidence of Jacob's truth. One afternoon, during a quiet moment after lunch, Mia sat beside Jacob as he colored another page. He was unusually focused, silent. And when she glanced at the page, her breath caught. It was a stick figure, labeled me. Trapped inside a house. With chains drawn over the windows. And next to him, another figure, a woman. Her eyes were X's. Her mouth a jagged line. "Who's that?" Mia asked softly. Jacob didn't answer. He just pressed harder with his crayon. And then, almost under his breath, he whispered, "She said not to tell. Or he'll be mad." That was the moment Mia knew something was deeply, dangerously wrong. Not just bruises. Not just neglect. But something darker. Something no one else seemed willing to see. She tried again with CPS. Called the hotline. Wrote an email. Even begged the school counselor to push harder. But each time, the response was the same. "We've looked into it. There's nothing we can do unless he says more." As if a 6-year-old was supposed to stand in front of a stranger and say the word abuse like it was just another spelling test. Mia felt powerless. Trapped between rules and reality. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't focus. Every time Jacob walked into her classroom, she looked for new bruises. Every time he left, she worried she'd just seen him for the last time. Until the day he handed her that note. Crinkled. Tiny. Barely legible. "Help me. He hurts mommy worse." It wasn't just a cry for help. It was a confession. A surrender. And in that moment, Mia knew the system wasn't going to protect him. The signs were everywhere. But no one else was looking. It was a Tuesday. Rain tapped softly against the classroom windows, and inside, the children buzzed with restless energy. Glue sticks, construction paper, and the smell of crayons filled the air, just another arts and crafts afternoon. But for Mia Lawson, everything was about to change. She'd barely noticed Jacob approach her desk. He didn't say a word. Just stood there, still and quiet, holding something small in his fist. When she looked up, he opened his palm. A folded piece of paper. No bigger than a gum wrapper. Crumpled. Damp from his hand. He placed it on the edge of her desk, then turned away like it never happened. At first, she thought nothing of it. Maybe it was a doodle. A thank you note. Kids did things like that. But something about Jacob's silence, his refusal to meet her eyes, made her hands tremble as she unfolded the paper. Inside, scribbled in a shaky scrawl, were just 7 words. "Help me. He hurts mommy worse." Her breath caught in her throat. The edges of the paper blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She read it again. And again. Each word sank like a stone in her chest. It wasn't just about Jacob anymore. It was about her. His mom. Whoever she was. Whatever was happening behind closed doors. Jacob had seen enough to understand fear. He had seen what pain looked like when it didn't stop at him. And somehow, he had found the courage to ask for help. But not from the police. Not from CPS. From her. Mia. His teacher. Because in his small, fragile world, she was the only adult who had ever truly listened. She could have gone straight to the principal. She could have called CPS again. But she already knew how that would go. More paperwork. Another visit. Another "we didn't find anything." And by the time they knocked on Jacob's door, would anyone even answer? That night, Mia sat alone on her couch, the note still in her hand. The television played some mindless show in the background. She didn't hear a word of it. All she could see was Jacob's face. His hollow eyes. The way his small shoulders curled inward, like he was trying to make himself invisible. She didn't sleep. At 2:13 a.m., she got out of bed and pulled out an old suitcase. She packed just enough clothes for a weekend. Some cash. A few of Jacob's school records she had copied weeks earlier, just in case. And a stuffed rabbit she kept in her classroom's calm corner. Jacob always reached for it when he was upset. She stared at the mirror. Her reflection looked back, wild-eyed, pale, scared. Am I really going to do this? But then she thought of the note. Help me. Help me. Help me. And just like that, the answer was yes. Not because she was reckless. Not because she wanted to be some kind of savior. But because someone had to say, enough. And it turns out, that someone was her. The next morning, everything felt normal on the outside. Jacob came to class wearing the same faded hoodie. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He quietly took his seat in the back row, just like always. But Mia watched him more closely than ever. She noticed a fresh mark peeking from under his sleeve. And for the first time, she didn't write it down. She didn't take a picture. She didn't add it to a file. She just saw it. And she knew. Tomorrow was the field trip. Buses, noise, confusion. Dozens of kids running around the museum. A perfect storm of distraction. No one would notice if a teacher and one small boy simply disappeared. No one would question it, at least not right away. But Mia knew, once they realized, there'd be no going back. She wasn't just risking her job. She was risking her freedom. She was risking everything. But when she looked at Jacob the next day, standing by himself at the edge of the bus line, clutching his backpack like it was armor, she understood something clearly for the first time. It was never really a choice. Because if she didn't do something, who would? So she walked over, took his hand, and they stepped away from the crowd. One foot in front of the other. Her grip tightening slightly. His eyes wide, but trusting. No one noticed. Not at first. Not until it was too late. And by then, they were already gone. The morning of the field trip felt ordinary. The kind of morning where the chaos of children buzzing with excitement fills the hallways. Shoelaces were being double knotted. Permission slips clutched in little hands. Clipboards. Whistles. Parents with cameras. But for Mia Lawson, everything was quiet. Inside her chest, it was just noise. She'd barely slept. Her stomach was twisted into something unrecognizable. She had rehearsed this in her head 100 times. But now that the moment was here, now that the buses were parked outside and the museum itinerary was in her pocket, she felt like her legs might give out. Still, she moved. She smiled at parents. Took attendance. Her voice steady, her hands calm. No one noticed the tension behind her eyes. No one saw the war waging inside her head. Except maybe Jacob. He was standing at the back of the group, small and silent, his backpack too big for his shoulders. There was something in his eyes that morning. Something that looked tired. Like even at 6 years old, he knew what it felt like to give up hope. But not today. Today would be different. When they arrived at the museum, everything unfolded exactly as she'd predicted. The other classes filed off the buses in clusters. Teachers called out instructions. Kids scattered like leaves in the wind. It was beautiful, in a way. Chaotic. Loud. No one would notice two people breaking away. No one would notice until it was far, far too late. Mia found Jacob near the museum steps. He was alone again. He always was. She walked up beside him slowly, like it was just another moment in a regular day. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Come with me," she said. He blinked. Looked up at her. Did he know? Did he understand what was about to happen? He didn't ask any questions. He just followed. They moved quickly but quietly. Past the museum gates. Past the school buses. Across the side parking lot where her car was already waiting, unlocked. She opened the passenger door. And for one terrible second, she froze. What if he changed his mind? What if someone saw? But Jacob didn't hesitate. He climbed in, sat down, and hugged his backpack to his chest. Mia shut the door. Her hand trembled as it gripped the steering wheel. The key turned. The engine came to life. And just like that, they were moving. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. She didn't check her phone. All she saw was the road in front of her, stretching out like a rope between two cliffs. In the seat beside her, Jacob didn't speak. He just stared out the window, legs swinging quietly. They drove for hours. No music. No talking. Only the hum of tires and the weight of what Mia had done pressing down on her like lead. She kept expecting flashing lights, sirens. But the road stayed quiet. At one point, she looked over and saw Jacob had fallen asleep. And somehow, that made it worse. Because for the first time, he looked peaceful. Like his body finally believed it was safe. And she wondered how long it had been since that happened. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. It was old, her aunt's place. Long abandoned. No cell service. No neighbors for miles. She hadn't been there in years. But now, it felt like the only place on earth where they wouldn't be found. Jacob climbed out of the car slowly, blinking at the forest around them. He didn't say anything. Just followed her up the porch steps and into the silence of the cabin. Inside, it smelled like dust and wood and something forgotten. But there was warmth to it. A kind of quiet safety. She unpacked a few snacks. Set out an old sleeping bag. Jacob watched her closely, like he wasn't sure if this was real. And honestly, neither was she. Mia sat across from him on the floor, cross-legged. The room lit only by soft orange glow leaking in through the dusty windows. She cleared her throat. "We'll stay here for a little while," she said gently. "Just until I figure out what to do next." Jacob nodded once. Then, after a pause, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn stuffed rabbit. He held it to his chest and whispered, "Thank you." 2 simple words. But they shattered her. Because in that moment, Mia knew. He had been waiting his entire life for someone to choose him. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that someone else was already looking for him. Someone who wasn't the villain she'd imagined. Someone who wasn't coming with sirens or threats, but with a desperate truth that would flip everything upside down. The first night passed without incident. The cabin was cold, but quiet. Jacob curled up in a sleeping bag, the stuffed rabbit clutched in his arms. Mia stayed up the entire night, knees pulled to her chest on the couch, eyes fixed on the front door. Every creak of the old wood made her heart jump. Every gust of wind felt like sirens in the distance. But no one came. By morning, the quiet almost felt normal. Jacob ate a granola bar for breakfast, colored in a notebook Mia had packed from the classroom. And for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. Just once. Barely there. But it was real. Mia watched him from the kitchen, her chest tight with something she hadn't expected, hope. Maybe they really had time. Maybe this plan, however reckless, might actually work. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. But she also knew, this moment, this pause, it was more peace than Jacob had known in a long, long time. And then, the knock came. Soft. Once. Then again. It was the kind of knock that didn't belong to law enforcement. No pounding. No yelling. No badges flashing through the window. Just a quiet knock. Like someone was asking permission. Mia froze. Jacob looked up from the floor, his crayon still in his hand. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She crept toward the window, every step loud in her ears. Outside, through the blur of fogged-up glass, she saw a man. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Mid-30s. Wearing a worn jacket, hair slightly disheveled, like he'd been driving for hours. No uniform. No police car. Just a man. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't pacing. He was just standing there, waiting. And then, almost like he sensed her on the other side of the door, he spoke. "I don't want to scare you." His voice was quiet. Steady. My name's Daniel. I'm Jacob's father. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Father? That couldn't be right. She'd read the school records. She'd seen the file. The man listed as Jacob's father was flagged for suspected abuse. The emergency contact line was crossed out. The address on record didn't even match. But now, that man, the supposed monster, was standing calmly on her porch, asking to see his son. She opened the door just an inch. Her voice was low, guarded. You're not supposed to be here. He met her eyes. Neither are you. Daniel didn't try to push his way in. Didn't raise his voice. Didn't call the cops. He just spoke. His voice didn't sound angry. It sounded broken. You don't know the whole story, he said. Please. Just let me explain. Mia wanted to slam the door in his face. Wanted to scream, you hurt him. He was covered in bruises. But something in Daniel's eyes stopped her. They weren't cold. They weren't cruel. They were tired. Desperate. I've been looking for him for 2 years, he said. Not to take him away. Not to punish anyone. Just to be his dad again. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her head was spinning. And then Daniel did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and slowly pulled out a small object. A worn, dirty stuffed animal, one ear half torn, the fur matted from years of love. Mr. Bubbles, he said, holding it gently. He used to sleep with this every night. Until they took him. Mia stared at it. She'd heard that name before. Jacob had mentioned it once, just once, while dozing off in the classroom nap corner. He whispered it like a secret, Mr. Bubbles. Daddy got him for me. Something cracked inside her. Everything she thought she knew. Everything she believed about this man. It all began to shift. She stepped back. Opened the door fully. Daniel didn't move until she nodded. He stepped inside like someone entering a church. Quiet. Careful. Reverent. Jacob was standing at the far end of the cabin. Frozen. His eyes locked on Daniel's. His mouth slightly open. And then, without warning, he ran. Straight into Daniel's arms. Daddy, Jacob cried, burying his face in his chest. Daniel dropped to his knees, clutching him like he was afraid he might disappear again. He kissed the top of his head. Over and over. I'm here. I'm here. I didn't stop looking. Not for one day. Mia stood silently. Watching. Processing. Trying to understand how she had gotten it all so wrong. But Daniel wasn't angry at her. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. Instead, he looked up with tears in his eyes. Thank you. For keeping him safe. And in that moment, Mia felt like the floor beneath her had shifted. Because this wasn't the man the files described. This wasn't the monster she had imagined. This was a father, heartbroken and whole at once, reunited with the child stolen from him. But the questions weren't over. The truth was still unraveling. And the past Mia thought she'd understood was about to be rewritten completely. For a long time, no one spoke. Jacob clung to his father like an anchor. His small arms wrapped tight around Daniel's neck, refusing to let go. Mia stood frozen a few feet away, her heartbeat loud in her ears, her mind a tangle of confusion. It didn't make sense. The man kneeling before her wasn't what she expected. He wasn't cold, or cruel. He didn't shout or threaten. He just held his son. Gently. Like someone holding something sacred. Like someone who had lost everything, and suddenly found it again. And when Jacob finally fell asleep curled up against his father's chest, Daniel looked up at Mia. And whispered, "You deserve to know the truth." They sat across from each other in the dim light of the cabin. A single lamp hummed beside them. Outside, the woods pressed in, quiet and still. And slowly, Daniel began to speak. Not with anger. Not to defend himself. But the way someone does when they've carried a truth too heavy for too long. Her name was Emily, he said. My wife. Jacob's mom. They met in college. Fell hard, fast. Moved into a tiny apartment and built a world out of second-hand furniture and midnight promises. When Emily got pregnant, they were terrified. But they were ready. They were in it, together. Until the delivery. Something went wrong. Complications. Panic. Machines. Daniel never forgot the way the doctor's voices changed. Or the silence that followed Jacob's first cry. Emily never opened her eyes again. She died that day, giving birth to the son she'd never get to hold. Daniel paused then. Rubbed his hands over his face. His voice dropped to a whisper. I was broken. But I still had Jacob. I still had her in him. But grief has a way of drawing sharks. Emily's parents, wealthy, powerful, and always disapproving, stepped in quickly. They said Daniel was too young, too unstable, that his grief made him unfit. At first, they offered help. A crib. A night nanny. But Daniel said no. He wanted to raise his son himself. That's when the threats started. Custody. Court. Claims that he was violent. That Jacob was unsafe. They had money. I didn't, Daniel said quietly. And eventually, they won. One night, while Daniel was at Emily's grave, bringing flowers on her birthday, Jacob disappeared from his apartment. No warning. No note. Just gone. By the time he returned, the crib was empty. The window cracked open. They told the courts he was neglectful. That he'd abandoned Jacob. That Emily's sister, Jacob's so-called mother, would care for him instead. Daniel tried everything. Filed reports. Hired lawyers. But the system that had failed Mia had also failed him. And so he did the only thing left. He searched. Every day. Every city. Until he found them. Jacob. His aunt. Enrolled under a different last name. Living in a town 2 states away. Just blocks from the school where Mia taught. Mia's hands were shaking. The bruises, she said quietly. The drawings. The fear. Daniel nodded. His jaw clenched. They told Jacob I hurt his mother. Told him I didn't want him. His eyes brimmed with tears. They yanked him out of my arms. Every time he tried to run to me, they pulled him back. He was punished for missing me. Mia felt her stomach twist. The drawings of the monster. The whispers of he hurts mommy. All of it. Reframed. It wasn't Daniel. It was the aunt. The one pretending to be Jacob's mother. The one Jacob was too young, and too confused, to understand wasn't his real mom. Everything Mia had seen. She'd just seen it through the wrong lens. I never gave up on him, Daniel said. Even when the world told me to move on. Even when I had nothing left. And Mia believed him. Because she could see it now, in the way he looked at Jacob, sleeping peacefully for once. In the way he carried that worn stuffed animal in his coat pocket for 2 years. In the way he hadn't come with rage. But with a plea. She sat back in her chair. Overwhelmed. She'd broken the law. Risked everything. And yet, somehow, she'd saved the right child, but from the wrong person. And now? Now the story wasn't about a villain and a victim. It was about a little boy torn between grief, lies, and love. And 2 adults who both just wanted to protect him in a world that refused to listen. The truth was out. But the danger wasn't over. Because eventually, the world would catch up to them. And they would have to decide. Come clean? Or keep running? That night, after Jacob had fallen back asleep in his father's arms. And after Daniel had drifted into an exhausted silence on the couch. Mia stood in the kitchen alone. The cabin creaked with the weight of secrets. Old wood, old ghosts. And now, the aftermath of one impossible truth. She stared at the cold cup of tea in her hand, untouched. And all she could think was, what do I do now? She had made a choice. A wild, desperate, dangerous choice. She had taken a child. Kidnapped him. And in doing so, she had broken the very rules she once lived her life by. But now? Now she had to ask herself. Had she actually done the right thing? For the wrong reasons? The image of Jacob's smile, earlier that day, flashed in her mind. His little hand reaching for her in the car. The way he had curled up safely on that cabin floor. Before Daniel ever arrived. He had trusted her. He had chosen her. And now she realized. She didn't save Jacob from his father. She had saved him for his father. Without meaning to. She'd brought a family back together. But the law wouldn't see it that way. The police were probably already searching. She hadn't checked her phone, but she could imagine the alerts. Missing child. Female suspect. Teacher. Her face. Her name. Ruined. Her career, gone. Her freedom? Likely next. She had no plan. No backup. And Daniel, he was just as vulnerable. He hadn't come with paperwork. He hadn't come with court orders or lawyers. He'd come with Mr. Bubbles. And a love too stubborn to die. But love didn't win in courtrooms. Evidence did. Custody orders. Lawyer fees. Judges. Mia pressed a hand to her chest. "What do I do now?" she whispered to the empty kitchen. Run? They could disappear. She could help Daniel and Jacob vanish for good. New names. New town. A second chance. But could Jacob live like that? Always looking over his shoulder? Never going to school again? Never feeling safe? Or, confess? Go to the police. Tell the truth. That she took Jacob without legal cause. That she believed the wrong story. And risk prison? Would they listen? Would they believe her when she said she thought she was saving them? Or would they slam the door? And take Jacob from Daniel all over again? Her mind spiraled. Because no matter how she turned it, someone was going to lose. Her job? Her record? Her future? Or Jacob's peace? Daniel's second chance? The next morning, she watched them from the porch. Daniel sat in the grass while Jacob ran in circles with a stick, pretending it was a sword. They laughed. A real laugh. Not the kind forced out of survival. It was the first time she'd ever heard that sound come from either of them. And that was when she realized. She couldn't undo the past. But she could decide what came next, so, Mia picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered above the screen. Police. News. Or her lawyer. But instead, she tapped on a name. Someone she knew wouldn't look at her like a criminal first. A friend in the district's legal office. Someone who might listen before judging. The phone rang. And with every ring, her heart pounded louder. She didn't know what would happen. Not exactly. She didn't know if she was walking into handcuffs. Or headlines. Or a courtroom full of strangers ready to tear her apart. But one thing was clear. She couldn't run. Not anymore. Not now that she knew the truth. Because sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't look clean or heroic. Sometimes it looks messy. Illegal. Painful. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing on the porch of a broken-down cabin, dialing a number that might destroy her life. And doing it anyway. The courtroom was cold. Too big. Too polished. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything smelled like paper, panic, and bad coffee. Mia Lawson sat in the defendant's chair. Hands folded. Back straight. Trying to breathe like she wasn't about to lose everything. To her left sat her lawyer, a public defender who had read her file twice and whispered, "This is bad," before they walked in. To her right. Empty. Daniel wasn't allowed to sit beside her. Not here. Not now. He was in the gallery, holding Jacob on his lap. And Jacob? Jacob just looked confused. Like he didn't understand why people were speaking so loudly. Why everyone kept saying the word kidnap. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Mia had taken a child without legal cause. She'd bypassed every safeguard, every protocol. She hadn't reported to authorities after receiving a concerning note. She acted on her own. A rogue teacher with good intentions is still a danger, the prosecutor said coldly. The judge nodded. Took notes. Expression unreadable. Mia's lawyer did what he could. Told them about the bruises. The failed CPS reports. He told them Mia wasn't a criminal. She was a witness to a system that failed. But the facts were facts. And facts didn't care about broken hearts or desperate fathers or little boys who slept better in a cabin than they ever had at home. Then came Daniel's turn. He requested to testify, not as a witness for the defense, but as Jacob's father. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You have no current custody rights," she said. Daniel nodded. "I know." His voice didn't shake. "But I need you to understand what this woman did. Saved my son." And so, He told the story. Not with anger. Not even with blame. Just a steady, quiet unraveling of everything that had been taken from him. Emily. Jacob. The nights spent driving to every town with a playground that resembled the one in his memory. The fake addresses. The lies told to keep him away. He held up the stuffed rabbit. He called this Mr. Bubbles, he said softly. He used to cry for it every night. I kept it in my jacket. Just in case I ever saw him again. The courtroom was silent. Even the prosecutor didn't object. Because sometimes, grief speaks louder than strategy. And then came Jacob. He hadn't been scheduled to speak. But near the end, when the judge asked if the child had been coached or coerced, Jacob surprised everyone. He stood, all on his own, holding a piece of crumpled construction paper. He walked to the judge's bench. I drew this, he said quietly. The judge leaned forward. On the page were 3 stick figures. A tall man, a woman, and a child between them. All holding hands. Underneath, in jagged red crayon, my real family. Mia couldn't breathe. Daniel looked away, blinking too fast. Even the judge paused. Because how do you argue with that? Not a lawyer's closing. Not a parent's plea. But the raw, unfiltered truth of a 6-year-old. The judge cleared her throat. This court does not excuse Ms. Lawson's actions. Mia straightened. Here it was. But it does acknowledge that the child in question was in emotional distress, and that the legal guardian listed at the time was not, in fact, his biological or court-appointed parent. Another pause. Therefore, Ms. Lawson will not face criminal charges, but will be placed under supervised review by the Board of Education. Mia exhaled. Barely. As for Mr. Daniel Hayes. Daniel gripped Jacob's hand. This court grants temporary custody pending full review, effective immediately. A sob broke from Daniel's chest. He pulled Jacob close. Mia couldn't move. Couldn't even cry. Because the gamble, the risk she took with everything she had, just paid off. Not with glory. Not with applause. But with one little boy. Finally going home. It didn't happen all at once. There was no parade. No fireworks. No happy music swelling in the background. It began with a quiet morning. Sunlight slipped through half-closed blinds. A pan sizzled softly on the stove. And for the first time in a long, long while, no one was afraid. Daniel stood in the kitchen in an old t-shirt, flipping pancakes one-handed while balancing a sleepy Jacob on his hip. Jacob mumbled something about chocolate chips. Daniel laughed and added them without a word. In the living room, Mia sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the two of them like it was a dream she was still afraid to touch. Because even now, after the courtroom, after the storm, it didn't feel real. They were free. Together. Jacob was home. But this wasn't the same home as before. It wasn't the apartment filled with grief where Daniel once lit candles under Emily's photo. It wasn't the cold walls of the wealthy family who tried to erase a father from his son's life. No. This was something new. A small house with a creaky porch. A wobbly kitchen table with 3 chairs instead of 2. It was late-night storybooks read by both voices. 2 lunchboxes packed every morning, one by Daniel, one by Mia. It was a child who no longer flinched when someone raised their voice. Who no longer woke up crying in the dark. It was Jacob drawing new pictures. Stick figures still, but now. 4 people. Daniel. Mia. Himself. And in the corner, Mr. Bubbles. Always watching. Daniel never tried to replace Emily. He still spoke of her sometimes, gently, with a look in his eyes that Mia never interrupted. But he also looked at Mia with something different. Not the fire of romance. Not yet. But something steadier. Trust. Respect. Gratitude that went deeper than words. Because she had done what no one else dared. She listened. She acted. And in doing so, she gave them back to each other. Mia didn't return to teaching. Not right away. Her license was under review, her name still whispered on news outlets that never bothered to ask the full story. But that was okay. She didn't need a classroom right now. She had something more important to protect. A life that finally felt like hers. A boy who ran to her with open arms. And a man who looked at her like she was the reason his heart still beat. Sometimes, people asked, "Are you his stepmom? Are you the nanny? Are you dating his dad?" And Mia would smile. Sometimes she said yes. Sometimes she said no. But the truth was simpler than that. She was just someone who showed up when it mattered. Who chose love over fear. Who stayed. One night, months later, Jacob called out from bed. "Can I sleep with you guys tonight?" Daniel looked at Mia. She nodded, smiling. Minutes later, Jacob lay between them, tiny arms wrapped around both their shoulders. In the dark, he whispered, "You're my best family." And that was all the answer they'd ever need. Because sometimes, the families we build mean more than the ones we're born into. Sometimes love doesn't follow rules. Or blood. Or permission. Sometimes, love just shows up. In a teacher who doesn't turn away. In a father who never stops searching. In a child who holds both of their hands and says, This is home." Wherever you're watching from right now, remember this. Sometimes, the most powerful kind of family is the one that chooses you back. Years later, Mia still hears that question. Sometimes in interviews. Sometimes whispered by strangers in grocery aisles. Sometimes, she even asks herself, why did you do it? Why risk everything, her job, her freedom, her future, for a boy who wasn't hers? Why ignore protocols and warnings, and take matters into her own trembling hands? Why step into a fire when the world told her to walk away? And maybe the answer has changed over time. Maybe it's still changing. In the beginning, Mia thought she was saving a child. She saw a boy with bruises and fear in his eyes. A boy who flinched at kindness. Who whispered, "He hurts mommy," like it was the only truth he had left. She thought he needed protection from the man who came to find them in the woods. The man she'd painted in her head as a monster. But that man turned out to be the one person who had never stopped fighting for Jacob. The one person who carried hope in his pocket, hope in the shape of a ragged stuffed rabbit. So maybe that's when everything shifted. Maybe that's when she realized. She wasn't saving Jacob from someone. She was saving him for someone. And in doing that, she saved more than just him. Because when Mia made that impossible choice, she didn't just save a child. She saved a father from being erased. She saved a little boy's faith and love. She saved herself from a life of following rules that never saved anyone. She saw a crack in the system and stepped into it. Not to break it, but to break through it. And now, when she looks back, not with shame, not with regret, but with something closer to peace, she understands. The question was never who did I save? The real question was always, who would I have become if I hadn't? Because sometimes, the story we tell isn't about the crime, or the courtroom, or even the risk. Sometimes, it's about the moment you realize that doing the right thing might cost you everything, and doing it anyway. She still doesn't have all the answers. She still gets asked, would you do it again? And the truth? She would. 1,000 times. Because that little boy, the one who used to draw monsters, now draws families. With big smiles. Holding hands. All three of them. And sometimes, in the corner, he still scribbles in a tiny stuffed bunny. Mr. Bubbles. Because love, in its purest form, doesn't need a name. It just needs someone brave enough to say, I see you. I believe you. And I won't let go. Thanks for watching. And before you go, tell us, what would you have done? Would you have made the same choice? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And wherever you're watching from, remember, sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes, they hold chalk and crayons. And sometimes, they steal a child, only to give him back everything he was missing. And before you go, ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have made the same choice? Leave a comment and tell us. Because sometimes, it's not just about the story. It's about the conversation it starts. And if stories like this speak to something inside you, if you believe in quiet courage, in complicated love, if you believe that even broken people can do something right, then subscribe to Heartfelt Tales TV. This is where stories like this live. Stories that aren't always perfect. But they're real, raw, and they matter. Because sometimes, the most unforgettable tales aren't found in headlines or history books. They're whispered in the moments where someone chooses love, even when it costs everything. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, hold on tight to the ones who make you brave.